The doctor, a Frenchman with a young and intelligent face, had been detached from his duties with the Douai Bureau to look after Bond's case. He came and stood beside Bond and put his hand on Bond's forehead while he looked at the temperature chart behind the bed. When he spoke, he was forthright. "You have a lot of questions to ask, my dear Mr. Bond," he said in excellent English, "and I can tell you most of the answers. I do not want you to waste your strength, so I will give you the salient facts, and then you may have a few minutes with Monsieur Mathis, who wishes to obtain one or two details from you. It is really too early for this talk, but I wish to set your mind at rest so we can proceed with the task of repairing your body without bothering too much about your mind." Nurse Gibson pulled up a chair for the doctor and left the room. "You've been here for about 2 days," continued the doctor. "Your car was found by a farmer on the way to the market in Royale, and he informed the police. After some delay, Monsieur Mathis heard that it was your car, and he immediately went to Les Noctambules with his men. You and Le Chiffre were found, and also your friend Miss Lind, who was unharmed and, according to her account, suffered no molestation. She was prostrated with shock, but is now fully recovered and is at her hotel. She has been instructed by her superior in London to stay at Royale under your orders until you are sufficiently recovered to go back to England. Le Chiffre's 2 gunmen are dead, each killed by a single .35 bullet in the back of the skull. From the lack of expression on their faces, they evidently never saw or heard their assailant. They were found in the same room as Miss Lind. Le Chiffre is dead, shot with a similar weapon between the eyes. Did you witness his death?" "Yes," said Bond. "Your own injuries are serious, but your life is not in danger, though you have lost a lot of blood. If all goes well, you will recover completely, and none of your functions of your body will be impaired." The doctor smiled grimly. "But I fear you will continue to be in pain for several days, and it will be my endeavor to give you as much comfort as possible. Now that you have regained consciousness, your arms will be freed, but you must not move your body, and when you sleep, the nurse has orders to secure your arms again. Above all, it is important that you rest and regain your strength. At the moment, you are suffering from a grave condition of mental and physical shock." The doctor paused. "For how long were you maltreated?" "About an hour," said Bond. "Then it is remarkable that you are alive, and I congratulate you. Few men could have supported what you have been through. Perhaps that is some consolation. As Monsieur Mathis can tell you, I have had in my time to treat a number of patients who have suffered similar handling, and not one of them has come through it the way you have done." The doctor looked at Bond for a moment and turned brusquely at Mathis. "You may have 10 minutes, and then you will be forcibly ejected. If you put the patient's temperature up, you will answer for it." Just an aside here, as obviously a big fan of the Bond movies, there's always moments in the movies where he's like strapped to a torture device or something, and the bad guys leave without actually making sure that the device kills him. So the first time I read this book, and definitely the first time I saw the movie, the fact that he actually gets brutally tortured was kind of a surprise. It's like the Austin Powers thing where the son is like, "Why don't we just kill him now? Why are you leaving him to this? I've got a gun, we'll just shoot him." Anyway, yes, the doctor looked at Bond for a moment and turned brusquely to Mathis. "You may have 10 minutes, and then you will be forcibly ejected. If you put the patient's temperature up, you will answer for it." He gave them both a broad smile and left the room. Mathis came over and took the doctor's chair. "That's a good man," said Bond. "I like him." "He's attached to the Bureau," said Mathis. "He's a very good man, and I will tell you about him one of these days. He thinks you are a prodigy, and so do I. However, that can wait. As you can imagine, there is much to clear up, and I am being pestered by Paris, and of course London, and even by Washington via our good friend Leiter. Incidentally," he broke off, "I have a personal message from M. He spoke to me himself on the telephone. He simply said to tell you that he is much impressed." I asked if that was all, and he said, "Well, tell him that the Treasury is greatly relieved." Then he rang off. Bond grinned with pleasure. What most warmed him was that M himself should have rung up Mathis. This was quite unheard of. The very existence of M, let alone his identity, was never admitted. He could imagine the flutter this must have caused in the ultra-security-minded organization in London. "A tall, thin man with one arm came over from London the same day we found you," continued Mathis, knowing from his own experience that these shop details would interest Bond. Bond is always very interested in the details, we've discovered. These shop details would interest Bond more than anything else and give him most pleasure. And he fixed up the nurses and looked after everything. Even your car's being repaired for you. He seemed to be Vesper's boss. He spent a lot of time with her and gave her strict instructions to look after you. Had of S, thought Bond. They're certainly giving me the red carpet treatment. Now, said Mathis, to business. Who killed Le Chiffre? Smersh, said Bond. Mathis gave a low whistle. My God, he said respectfully. So they were onto him. What did he look like? Bond explained briefly what had happened up to the moment of Le Chiffre's death, omitting all but the most essential details. It cost him an effort, and he was glad when it was done. Casting his mind back to the scene awoke the whole nightmare, and the sweat began to pour off his forehead, and a deep throb of pain stared up at his body. Mathis realized that he was going too far. Bond's voice was getting feebler, and his eyes were clouding. Mathis snapped shut his shorthand book and laid a hand on Bond's shoulder. Forgive me, my friend, he said. It is all over now, and you are in safe hands. All is well, and the whole plan has gone splendidly. We have announced that Le Chiffre shot his 2 accomplices and then committed suicide because he could not face an inquiry of the Union funds. Strasbourg and the North are in uproar. He was considered a great hero there and a pillar of the Communist Party in France. This story of brothels and casinos has absolutely knocked the bottom out of his organization, and they're all running around like scalded cats the moment the Communist Party is giving out that he was off his head. But that hasn't helped much after Thor's breakdown not long ago. They're just making it look as if all their big shots were gaga. God knows how they're going to unscramble this whole business. Mathis saw that his enthusiasm had had the desired effect. Bond's eyes were brighter. One last mystery, Mathis said, and then I promise I will go. He looked at his watch. The doctor will be after my skin in a moment. Now, what about the money? Where is it? Where did you hide it? We too have been over your room with a tooth comb. It isn't there. Bond grinned. It is, he said, more or less. On the door of each room there is a small square of black plastic with the number of the room on it. On the corridor side, of course. When Leiter left me that night, I simply opened the door and unscrewed my number plate and put the folded check underneath it and screwed the plate back. It'll be there. He smiled. I'm glad there's something the stupid English can teach the clever French. Mathis laughed delightedly. I suppose you think that's paid me back for knowing what the Munces were up to. Well, I'll call it quits. Incidentally, we've got them in the bag. They were just some minor fry hired for the occasion. We'll see that they get a few years. He arose hastily as the doctor stormed into the room and took one look at Bond. Out, he said to Mathis. Out, and don't come back. Mathis just had time to wave cheerfully to Bond and call some hasty words of farewell before he was hustled through the door. Bond heard a torrent of heated French diminishing down the corridor. He lay back exhausted, but heartened by all he had heard. He found himself thinking of Vesper as he quickly drifted off into a troubled sleep. There were still questions to be answered, but they could wait. And that's the end of chapter 19. I'll make another aside here. My mother has been listening to me read these chapters, and she was asking if I knew what he did with the check. And I couldn't remember, I suspected the number plate, and I've read this book before, but I read it like 25 years ago, or 20 years ago, whatever. So I couldn't put together, I was like, do I remember this from reading the book, or am I just coming up with that on my own? And it turns out I was right, so I must have just remembered it from reading the book back in the day. Somehow I just knew that it was behind the number plate. And then the other thing is, obviously I've seen the movie a lot more recently than I've read this book. And in the movie, it was in 2006, so there was no check. I think it's a passcode or something like that for electronic transfer that they're trying to get in the movie. But turns out I was right, behind the number plate. Although I thought it was the number plate on the door. I think you described it as the number plate next to the door. Anyway, carrying on. Chapter 20, The Nature of Evil. Bond made good progress. When Mathis came to see him 3 days later, he was propped up in bed and his arms were free. The lower half of his body was still shrouded in the oblong tent, but he looked cheerful, and it was only occasionally that a twinge of pain narrowed his eyes. Mathis looked crestfallen. "Here's your check," he said to Bond. "I've rather enjoyed walking around with 40 million francs in my pocket, but I suppose you'd better sign it and I'll put it in your account with the credit. Leone's." "There's no sign of our friend from Smirch. Not a damn trace. He must have got to the villa on foot or on a bicycle, because you heard nothing of his arrival, and the two gunmen obviously didn't. It's pretty exasperating. We've got precious little on this Smirch organization, and neither has London. Washington said they had, but turned out to be the usual waffle from refugee interrogation, and you know what that's about as much as good interrogating. And you know that's about as much good as interrogating an Englishman in the street about his own Secret Service, or a Frenchman about the Dôme." "He probably came from Leningrad to Berlin via Warsaw," said Bond. "From Berlin they've got plenty of routes open to the rest of Europe. He's back home by now, being told off for not shooting me too. I fancy they've got quite a file on me in view of one or two of the jobs M's given me since the war. He obviously thought he was being smart enough cutting his initial in my hand." "What's that?" asked Mathis. "The doctor said the cuts looked like a square M with a tail on the top. He said they didn't mean anything." "Well, I only got a glimpse before I passed out, but I've seen the cuts several times while they were being dressed, and I'm pretty certain that they're the Russian letter for SH. It's rather like an inverted M with a tail. That would make some sense. Smirch is short for Schmiertspionom, death to spies, and he thinks he's labeled me as a Spionom. It's a nuisance because M will probably say I've got to go to the hospital, and again... M will probably say I've got to go to the hospital again when I get back to London, and have new skin grafted over the whole of the back of my hand. It doesn't matter much. I've decided to resign." Mathis looked at him with his mouth open. "Resign?" he asked incredulously. "What the hell for?" Bond looked away from Mathis. He studied his bandaged hands. "When I was being beaten up," he said, "I suddenly liked the idea of being alive. Before the sheath began, he used a phrase which stuck in my mind. 'Playing Red Indians,' he said. That's what I had been doing. Well, I suddenly thought he might be right. 'You see,' he said, still looking down at his bandages, 'when one's young, it seems very easy to distinguish between right and wrong, but as one gets older, it becomes more difficult. At school, it's easy to pick out one's own villains and heroes, and one grows up wanting to be a hero and kill the villains.'" He looked at Mathis. "Well, in the last few years, I've killed 2 villains. The first was in New York, a Japanese cipher expert cracking our codes on the 36th floor of the RCA building in Rockefeller Center, where the... wow, this is a very 50s term that it says here, so I won't say it. Where the Japanese had their consulate. I took a room on the 40th floor of the next door skyscraper, and I could look across the street into his room and see him working. Then I got a colleague from our organization in New York, and a couple of Remington 33s with telescopic sights and silencers. We smuggled them up to my room and sat for days waiting for our chance. He had shot at the second man before me. His job was only to blast a hole through the window so that I could shoot the Japanese man through it. They have tough windows at Rockefeller Center to keep the noise out. It worked very well. As I expected, his bullet got deflected by the glass and went God knows where, but I shot immediately after him, through the hole he had made. I got the man in the mouth as he turned to gape at the broken window. Bond smoked for a minute in the hospital. Another aside here. I remembered that, the film starts with Bond getting his 2 kills and earning his 00. And earlier in this book, he described all you needed to get a 00 was 2 kills. I remembered that somewhere in this book, he describes his 2 kills and how he got the 00s. I thought it was closer to the beginning. Maybe just because the movie opens with that. But here we are, his descriptions of his 2 kills that earned his 00. This one being the assassination through a bullet hole at Rockefeller Center. Yes, and now he's smoking in the hospital. Bond smoked for a minute. It was a pretty sound job, nice and clean too. 300 yards away, no personal contact. The next time in Stockholm wasn't so pretty. I had to kill a Norwegian man who was doubling against us for the Germans. He'd managed to get 2 of our men captured, probably bumped off for all I know. For various reasons, it took to be an absolutely silent job. It had to be an absolutely silent job. Pardon me. I chose the bedroom of his flat, and a knife, and well, he just didn't die very quickly. For those 2 jobs, I was awarded a 00 number in the service. Felt pretty clever and got a reputation for being good and tough. A 00 number in our service means you've had to kill a chap in cold blood in the course of some job. Now, he looked up at Mathis. That's all very fine. The hero kills 2 villains, but when the hero, Le Chiffre, starts to kill the villain Bond, and the villain Bond knows he isn't a villain at all, you see the other side of the medal. The villains and the heroes get all mixed up. Of course, he added, as Mathis started to expostulate, patriotism comes along and makes it seem fairly all right. But this country, right or wrong, business is getting a little out of date. Today we are fighting communism. Okay, if I'd been alive 50 years ago, the brand of conservatism we have today would have been damn near called communism. And we should have been told to go and fight that. History is moving pretty quickly these days, and the heroes and the villains keep on changing roles. Mathis stared at him aghast. Then he tapped his head and put a calming hand on Bond's arm. You mean to say that this precious Le Chiffre, who did his best to turn you into a eunuch, doesn't qualify as a villain? He asked. Anyone would think him from the rot you talk that he had been battering your head instead of your... He gestured down to the bed. You wait till M tells you to get after another Le Chiffre. I bet you'll go right after him. And what about Smersh? I can tell you I don't like the idea of these chaps running around France killing anyone they feel has been a traitor to their precious political system. You're a bloody anarchist. He threw his arms in the air and let them fall helplessly to his sides. Bond laughed. All right, he said. Take our friend Le Chiffre. It's simple enough to say he was an evil man. At least it's simple enough for me because he did evil things to me. If he was here now, I wouldn't hesitate to kill him. But out of personal revenge and not, I'm afraid, for some high moral reason or for the sake of any country. He looked up at Mathis to see how bored he was getting with these introspective refinements of what to Mathis was a simple question of duty. Mathis smiled back at him. Continue, my dear friend. It is interesting for me to see this new Bond. Englishmen are so odd. They are like a nest of Chinese boxes. It takes a very long time to get to the center of them. When one gets there, the result is unrewarding, but the process is instructive and entertaining. Continue. Develop your arguments. There may be something I can use to my own chief the next time I want to get out of an unpleasant job. He grinned maliciously. Bond ignored him. Pardon me for just a moment. Now, in order to tell the difference between good and evil, we've manufactured two images representing the extremes, representing the deepest black and the purest white, and we call them God and the devil. But in doing so, we've cheated a bit. God is a clear image. You can see every hair on his beard. But the devil? What does he look like? Bond looked triumphantly at Mathis. Mathis laughed ironically. A woman. It's all very fine, said Bond, but I've been thinking about these things, and I'm wondering whose side I ought to be on. I'm getting very sorry for the devil and his disciples. Such is the good Le Chiffre. The devil has a rotten time, and I always like to be on the side of the underdog. We don't give the poor chap a chance. There's a good book about goodness and how to be good and so forth, but there's no evil book about evil and how to be bad. The devil had no prophets to write his 10 commandments, and no team of authors to write his biography. His case has gone completely by default. We know nothing about him, but a lot of fairy stories and from our parents and our schoolmasters. He has no book from which we can learn the nature of evil in all its forms, with parables about evil people and proverbs about evil people, folklore about evil people. All we have is the living example of the people who are at least good on our own intuition. So, continued Bond, warming to his argument, Le Chiffre was serving a wonderful purpose, a really vital purpose, perhaps the best and highest purpose of all. By his evil existence, which foolishly I have helped to destroy, he was creating a norm of badness by which, and by which alone, any opposite norm of goodness could exist. We were privileged in our short knowledge of him to see and estimate his wickedness, and we emerge from the acquaintanceship better and more virtuous men. And we have the end of side 1 of our record. So let me flip that over, and I'll continue on Bond's thoughts about the nature of good and evil. Oh, also, sorry. Before I start again, just remember that yesterday I drew attention to this book that I have here, the official 007 fact file from 1989. And in the back of it is the Bond quiz number 2 portion, which I asked 2 questions from yesterday. I didn't see a response on Facebook, and I have to apologize. I lost my Instagram comments before I was able to look at them. But my 2 questions are, which Bond film did Bond make his escape in a moon buggy? Without even having to look it up, I can tell you that was Diamonds Are Forever. There's a scene where Bond is in a laboratory in the Nevada desert outside of Las Vegas, and he's making his breakaway, and he comes into a room where they're filming the moon landing. Basically, it's playing on that conspiracy theory, but Bond jumps in the moon buggy, blasts through the wall, and drives to the desert in a moon buggy. And then the other question I asked was which of these villains? Which of the following villains survived their encounters with 007? And there's 12 villains listed here. It's Jaws. Jaws survived. Jaws, played by Richard Kiel, large, 7-foot-tall guy with metal teeth. First introduced in Spy Who Loved Me, Bond dropped Jaws into a tank filled with sharks, and Jaws bit the sharks and swam away. And then Jaws shows up again in Moonraker, trying to kill Bond for most of the movie, but by the end, Jaws finds unlikely love and helps Bond actually escape before escaping himself. So before the Bond franchise was relaunched with Daniel Craig in Casino Royale, Jaws survived. He was out there somewhere in the James Bond universe, still alive. Okay, anyway, now I need to find where I left off. Yes, okay. Bravo, said Mathis. Bravo, said Mathis. I'm proud of you. You ought to be tortured every day. I really must remember to do something evil this morning. I must start at once. I have a few marks in my favor, only small ones. Alas, he added ruefully. But I shall work fast now that I've seen the light. What a splendid time I'm going to have. Now, let's see, where shall I start? Murder, arson, rape? But no, these... No, I'm not going to do these. I must really consult the good Marquis de Sade. I mean, I am a child, an absolute child in these matters. His face fell. Ah, that our conscience, my dear Bond. What shall we do with him while we are committing some juicy evil? That is a problem. He is a crafty person, this Conscious, and very odd, as old as the first family of apes which gave birth to him. We must give that problem a really careful thought, or we shall spoil our enjoyment. Of course we should murder him first, but he is a tough bird. It'll be difficult, but we'll succeed. We could be worse even than Le Chiffre. For you, dear James, it is easy. You can start off by resigning. That was a brilliant thought of yours, a splendid start to your new career. And so simple. Everyone has the revolver of resignation in his pocket. All you've got to do is pull the trigger, and you will have made a big hole in your country and your conscience at the same time. A murder and a suicide with a bullet? Splendid. What a difficult and glorious profession. As for me, I must start embracing the new cause at once. He looked at his watch. Good, I've started already. I'm half an hour late for a meeting with the chief of police. He rose to his feet, laughing. That was most enjoyable, my dear James. You really ought to go on the halls. Now, about that little problem of yours, this business of not knowing good men from bad men, and villains from heroes and so forth. It is, of course, a difficult problem in the abstract. The secret lies in personal experience, whether you're another 50s term. Whether you're Chinese or an Englishman. Sorry for the revised reading. There's just some things I'm not comfortable saying. He paused at the door. You admit that Le Chiffre did you personal evil. and that you would kill him if he had appeared in front of you now. Well, when you get back to London, and you will find another Le Chiffre seeking to destroy you and your friends and your country, M will tell you about them. And now that you have seen a really evil man, you will know how evil they can be, and you will go after them to destroy them in order to protect yourself and the people you love. You won't wait or argue about it. You know what they look like now and what they can do to people. You may be a bit more choosy about the jobs you take on. You may want to be certain that the target really is dark, but there are plenty of really dark targets around. There's still plenty for you to do, and you'll do it. And when you fall in love and have a mistress or a wife and children to look after, it will seem all the easier. Mathis opened the door and stopped on the threshold. Surround yourself with human beings, my dear James. They are easier to fight, far more than principles. He laughed. But don't let me down and become human yourself. We would lose such a wonderful machine. With a wave of the hand, he shut the door. Hey, shouted Bond, but the footsteps went quickly off down the passage. Pardon me. And that was the end of Chapter 20. Chapter 21. Vesper. It was on the next day that Bond asked to see Vesper. He had not wanted to see her before. He was told that every day she came to the nursing home and asked for him. Flowers had arrived from her. Bond didn't like flowers, and he told the nurse to give them to another patient. After this had happened twice, no more flowers came. Bond had not meant to offend her. He disliked having feminine things around him. Flowers seemed to ask for recognition of the person who had sent them, to be constantly transmitting a message of sympathy and affection. Bond found this irksome. He disliked being cosseted. It gave him claustrophobia. Bond was bored at the idea of having to explain some of this to Vesper, and he was embarrassed at having to ask one or two questions which mystified him. Questions about Vesper's behavior. The answers would almost certainly make her out to be a fool. Then he had his full report to M to think about. In this, he didn't want to have to criticize Vesper. It might easily cost her job. But above all, he admitted to himself, he shirked the answer to a more painful question. The doctor had talked often to Bond about his injuries. He had always told him that there would be no evil effects from the terrible battering his body had received. He had said that Bond's full health would return, and that none of his powers had been taken from him. His powers. But the evidence of Bond's eyes and his nerves refused these comforting assurances. He was still painfully swollen and bruised, and whenever the injections wore off, he was in agony. Above all this, his imagination had suffered. For an hour in that room with the chief, the certainty of impotence had been beaten into him, and a scar had been left on his mind that can only be healed by experience. From the day when Bond first met Vesper in the Hermitage bar, he had found her desirable, and he knew that if things had been different in the nightclub, if Vesper had responded in any way, and if there had been no kidnapping, he would have tried to sleep with her that night. Even later, in the car outside the villa, when he had had other things to think about, his eroticism had been hotly aroused by the sight of her indecent nakedness. And now, when he could see her again, he was afraid. Afraid that his senses and his body would not respond to her sensual beauty. Afraid that he would feel no stir of desire, and that his blood would stay cool. In his mind, he had made his first meeting into a test. He was shirking the answer. That was the real reason, he admitted, why he had waited to give his body a chance to respond. Why he had put off their first meeting for over a week. He would have liked to put off the meeting still further, but he explained to himself that his report must be written, that any day an emissary from London would come over and want to hear the full story, and that today was as good as tomorrow, that anyway, he might as well know the worst. So, on the 8th day, he asked for her, for the early morning when he was feeling refreshed and strong after the night's rest. For no reason at all, he had expected that she would show some sign of her experiences, that she would look pale or even ill. He was not prepared for the tall, bronzed girl in a cream tussore frock with a black belt who came happily through the door and stood smiling at him. Pardon me just a moment. Good heavens, Vesper, he said with a wry gesture of welcome. You look absolutely beautiful. You must thrive on disaster. How have you managed to get such a wonderful sunburn? Well, I feel very guilty, she said, sitting down beside him. But I've been bathing every day while you've been lying here. The doctor said I was two and the doctor said I was two and head of S said to as well. So, well, I just thought I wouldn't help you for me to be moping around all day in my room. I found a wonderful stretch of sand down the coast, and I take my lunch and go there every day with a book, and I don't come back till the evening. There's a bus that takes me there and back with only a short walk over the dunes, and I've managed to get over the fact that it's on the way down the road to the villa. Her voice faltered. The mention of the villa had made Bond's eyes flicker. She continued bravely, refusing to be defeated by Bond's lack of response. Well, the doctor says it won't be long before you're allowed up. I thought perhaps I could take you down to this beach later on. The doctor says that bathing would be very good for you. Bond grunted. God knows when I'll be able to bathe, he said. The doctor's talking through his hat. And when I can bathe, it would probably be better for me to bathe alone for a bit. I don't want to frighten anybody. Apart from anything else, he glanced pointedly down the bed. My body's a mass of scars and bruises. But you enjoy yourself. There's no reason why you shouldn't enjoy yourself. Vesper was stung by the bitterness and injustice in his voice. I'm sorry, she said. I was just trying. Suddenly her eyes filled with tears. She swallowed. I wanted to help you get well. Her voice strangled. She looked piteously at him, facing the accusation in his eyes and in his manner. Then she broke down and buried her face in her hands and sobbed. I'm sorry, she said in a muffled voice. I'm really sorry. With one hand, she searched for a handkerchief in her bag. It's all my fault. She dabbed at her eyes. I know it's my fault. Bond at once relented. He put out a bandaged hand and laid it on her knee. It's all right, Vesper. I'm sorry I was so rough. It's just that I was jealous of you in the sunshine while I'm stuck here. Directly I'm well enough, I'll come with you, and you must show me your beach. Of course it's just what I want. It'll be wonderful to get out again. She pressed his hand and stood up and walked over to the window. After a moment, she busied herself with her makeup. Then she came back to the bed. Bond looked at her tenderly. Like all harsh, cold men, he was easily tipped over into sentiment. She was very beautiful, and he felt warmth towards her. He decided to make his questions as easy as possible. He gave her a cigarette, and for a time they talked of the visit of Head of S, and of the reactions in London to the rout of Le Chiffre. Just an aside here for anybody who was not here at the beginning or for my previous recaps, Head of S is the branch of the British Secret Service that deals with Soviet affairs. The head of S is the head of that division. He devised the plan. Vesper was his personal assistant, so he sent her on behalf of himself. So he gave her a cigarette, and for a time they talked of the visit of Head of S and of the reactions in London to the rout of Le Chiffre. From what she said, it was clear that the final object of the plan had been more than fulfilled. The story was still being splashed all over the world, and correspondents of most of the English and American papers had been at Royale trying to trace the Jamaican millionaire who had defeated Le Chiffre at the tables. Another aside, Bond was undercover as a Jamaican businessman. A British man who works in Jamaica. Yes, so the English and American papers had been at Royale trying to trace the Jamaican millionaire who had defeated Le Chiffre at the tables. They had got onto Vesper, but she had covered up very well. Her story was that Bond had told her he was going on to Cannes and Monte Carlo to gamble with his winnings. The hunt had moved on down south of France. Mathis and the police had obliterated all other traces, and the papers were forced to concentrate on the Strasbourg angles and the chaos in the ranks of the French communists. By the way, Vesper, said Bond after a time, what really happened to you after you left me in the nightclub? All I saw was the actual kidnapping. He told her briefly of the scene outside the casino. I'm afraid I must have lost my head, said Vesper, avoiding Bond's eyes. When I couldn't see Mathis anywhere in the entrance hall, I went outside, and the commissaire asked me if I was Miss Lind, and then told me the man who had sent in the note was waiting in a car down on the right of the steps. Somehow I wasn't particularly surprised. I'd only known Mathis for a day or two. and didn't know how he worked, so I just walked down towards the car. It was away on the right and more or less in the shadows. Just as I was coming up to it, the chief's two men jumped out from behind one of the other cars in the row and simply scooped up my skirt over my head. Vesper blushed. It sounds a childish trick. She looked at him, but it's really frightfully effective. One's a complete prisoner, and although I screamed, I don't expect any sound came from under my skirt. I kicked out as hard as I could. Another aside, just filling in, she was wearing a velvet dress. They pulled the dress up over her arms and head, and then tied it at the top, and that's how they transported her. I kicked out as hard as I could, but that was no use, as I couldn't see and my arms were absolutely helpless. I was just a trussed chicken. They picked me up between them and shoved me into the back of the car. I went on struggling, of course, and when the car started and while they were trying to tie a rope or something around the top of my skirt over my head, I managed to get an arm free and throw my bag through the window. I hope it was some use. Bond nodded. It was really instinctive. I just thought you'd have no idea what happened to me, and I was terrified. I did the first thing I could think of. Bond knew it was him they'd been after, and that if Vesper hadn't thrown her bag out, they would probably have thrown it out themselves directly they saw him appear on the steps. It certainly helped, said Bond, but why didn't you make any sign when they finally got me after the car smash? When I spoke to you, I was dreadfully worried. I thought they might have knocked you out or something. I'm afraid I must have been unconscious, she said. I fainted once from lack of air, and when I came to, they had cut a hole in the front of my face. I must have fainted again. I don't remember much until we got to the villa. I really only gathered that you had been captured when I heard you try and come after me in the passage. Bond had made some feeble attempts in the hallway before they escorted him in the room to torture him. And he said he didn't even know why he was trying to do anything at that point. It was pretty hopeless. He just thought maybe he could communicate to Vesper to not say anything. And they didn't touch you? Asked Bond. They didn't try and mess about you while I was being beaten up? No, said Vesper. They just left me in an armchair. They drank and played cards. Bullet, I think, is from what I heard. And then they went to sleep. I suppose that was how Smirsh got to them. They bound my legs and put me on a chair in a corner facing the wall, and I saw nothing of Smirsh. I heard some odd noises. I expect they woke me up. And then what sounded like one of them falling off his chair. Then there were some soft footsteps and the door closed. And then nothing happened until Mathis and the police burst in hours later. I slept most of the time. I had no idea what had happened to you, but she faltered. I did once hear a terrible scream. It sounded very far away. At least I think it must have been a scream. At the time I thought it might have been a nightmare. I'm afraid that must have been me, said Bond. Vesper put out a hand and touched one of his, her eyes filled with tears. It's horrible, she said. The things they did to you. It was all my fault. If only... She buried her face in her hands. That's all right, said Bond comfortingly. It's no good crying over spilt milk. It's all over now, and thank heavens they let you alone. He patted her knee. They were going to start on you when they'd got me really softened up. We've got a lot to thank Smirsh for. Now, come on, let's forget about it. It certainly wasn't anything to do with you. Anybody could have fallen for that note. Anyway, it's all water over the dam, he added cheerfully. Anybody could have fallen for that note. It was not what he was saying when she fell for that note. Vesper looked at him, gratefully through her tears. You really promise? She asked. I thought you would never forgive me. I'll try and make it up to you. Somehow. She looked at him. Somehow? Thought Bond to himself. He looked at her. She was smiling at him. He smiled back. You better look out, he said. I may hold you to that. She looked into his eyes and said nothing, but the enigmatic challenge was back. She pressed his hand and rose. A promise is a promise, she said. This time they both knew what that promise was. She picked up her bag from the bed and walked to the door. Shall I come tomorrow? She looked at Bond gravely. Yes, please, Vesper, said Bond. I'd like that. Please, do some more exploring. It'll be fun to think of what we can do when I get up. Will you think of some things? Yes, said Vesper. Please get well quickly. They gazed at each other for a second. Then she went out and closed the door, and Bond listened until the sound of her footsteps had died away. The the end of chapter 21. And we're almost to the end of the record. I'll read a couple more paragraphs. If I have to reread them tomorrow, I will. Chapter 22. The Hastening Saloon. From that day, Bond's recovery was rapid. He sat up in bed and wrote his report to M. He made light of what he had still considered amateurish behavior on the part of Vesper. But juggling with the emphasis, he made the kidnapping sound much more Machiavellian than it had been. He praised Vesper's coolness and composure throughout the whole episode, without saying that he had found some of her actions unaccountable. Every day, Vesper came to see him, and he looked forward to these visits with excitement. She talked happily of her adventures of the day before, her explorations down the coast, in the restaurants where she had eaten. Remember eating at restaurants? She made friends with the chief of police, and with one of the directors of the casino, and it was they who took her out in the evening and occasionally lent her a car during the day. She kept an eye on the repairs to the Bentley. James Bond drives a Bentley in this, and that was the car that he crashed earlier, which had been towed down to coach builders at Royale, and she even arranged for some new clothes to be sent out from Bond's London flat. Nothing survived from his original wardrobe. Every stitch had been cut to ribbons in the search for the 40 million francs. The Le Chiffre affair was never mentioned between them. She occasionally told Bond amusing stories of Head of S's office. She had apparently transferred that there from the WRNS, and he told her of some of his adventures in the service. He found he could speak to her easily, and he was surprised. With most women, his manner was a mixture of taciturnity and passion. The lengthy approaches to a seduction bored him almost as much as the subsequent mess of disentanglement. He found something grisly in the inevitability of the pattern of each affair. The conventional parabola sentiment, the touch of the hand, the kiss, the passionate kiss, the feel of the body, the climax in bed, then more bed, then less bed, then the boredom, the tears, and the final bitterness, was to him shameful and hypocritical. Even more, he shunned the mise en scène for each of these acts in the play, the meeting at a party, the restaurant, the taxi, his flat, her flat, then the weekend by the sea, then the flats again, then the furtive alibis, and the final angry farewell on some doorstep in the rain. I don't know that French term that I just said. I'm curious if that was something that was common in the 50s. But with Vesper, there could be none of this. In the dull room and the boredom of his treatment, her presence was each day an oasis of pleasure, something to look forward to. In their talk, there was nothing but companionship, with a distant undertone of passion. In the background, there was the unspoken zest of the promise, which in the course, and in their own time, would be met. Overall, there brooded the shadow of his injuries and the tantalus of their slow healing. Whether Bond liked it or not, the branch had already escaped his knife and was ready to burst into flower. With enjoyable steps, Bond recovered. He was allowed up. Then he was allowed to sit in the garden. Then he could go for a short walk. Then for a long drive. And then the afternoon came when the doctor agreed on a flying visit from Paris and pronounced him well again. His clothes were brought round by Vesper. Farewells were exchanged with the nurses, and a hired car drove them away. It was 3 weeks from the day when he had been on the edge of death, and that was July, and the hot summer shimmered down on the coast and out at the sea. Bond clasped the moment to him. Their destination was to be a surprise for him. He had not wanted to go back to one of the big hotels in Royale, and Vesper said she would find somewhere away from the town. But she insisted on being mysterious about it, and only said that she had found a place he would like. He was happy to be in her hands, but he covered up his surrender by referring to their destination as Trois-sur-Mer. She admitted it was by the sea. I didn't know if I was still going to have to apologize for not speaking French, but here I am, slaughtering French words again. In lauding the rustic delights of outside lavatories, bedbugs, and cockroaches, the drive was spoiled by a curious incident. An incident we will apparently find out more about tomorrow, because our time is up for today. The record has ended, which means I will bid you all adieu. That's the gist of my French.